session of the morning is Ronald Broude. Ronald Broude is the principal of Broude Brothers Limited and founding trustee of Broude Trust for the publication of musicological editions. He is active in the fields of editorial theory and practice and has published in journals ranging from the American Organist and Early Music America to textual cultures and scholarly editing. He is also a member of the board of the Society for Textual Scholarship and has served as executive director of that organization from 2004 to 2005. In 2010, he received the Association for Documentary Editing's Voigtson Prize. His talk for us today is The Origins of Urtext.
No video, so if you can't hear me, let me know. That's important. The lexicon of music publishing has never been a model of precision. This is because the same music often attracts a broad range of users, from sophisticated musicologists and top-flight performers to amateurs of modest abilities. For the most popular works, there is a broad range of editions, each intended to meet the needs of a different rank in this hierarchy. Rank in this hierarchy varies inversely with how much is changed in or added to the original sources. At the top of the hierarchy are musicological editions. These are usually based on the earliest available sources, which they represent with the least alteration. Editors understand that the less they change, the longer will their editions be useful. Down market are the sorts of editions in which the editor provides all sorts of markings to indicate how the edited piece is to be played. Technical markings such as fingerings, bowings, interpretive markings such as dynamics and tempi. There is a tendency for terminology to move down market. A term once used to describe a musicologically top-flight edition is altruistically deployed down market in order to enhance the purchaser's self-esteem. So the meaning of a term that describes editions is always a function of its historical context, of when in the history of the term it is being used. What you will hear in the next few minutes is a story of one such term, urtext. It's a tale of ignorance, greed, deception, sorry, no sex, and progress. It is an edifying and uplifting history. The word urtext comes to English from the German. When urtext was first employed in musical contexts, it meant an edition in which the editor had added no performing indications, no technical guidance, no interpretive suggestions. But in the last 60 years, the meaning of urtext has expanded in such a way that it is now almost impossible to understand what features the designation urtext on the cover of a musical publication may be intended to call attention to. To complicate matters, apologists for the misuse of the word have tried to justify their misprision by arguing that the word urtext has always been a term of indeterminacy, of fuzzy meaning. Urtext is one of German's compound nouns, in this case consisting of an adjective and a masculine noun text. The prefix means in German original or earliest. It also conveys a sense of something that is pure and undefiled. Behind the German lies a biblical city of the of the Chaldees, in which Genesis chapter 11 tells us Abraham was born and from which he and his family went forth. As a prefix, the word is crept into English so that if one speaks, for example, of the meaning of urtext, it is understood that one is speaking of the original meaning of urtext. The word text has several meanings, and which one is intended by a speaker or writer must be inferred from the context in which it is used. Since urtext implies a text-critical context, we can understand text to mean a unique arrangement of symbols by which a work of literature, of theater, of music is represented. In addition, again speaking in a text-critical context, is a text specially prepared for the benefit of a certain class of users. In German, urtext goes back to the late 18th century when German academicians were busy inventing the discipline of philology. As originally predicated, philology was the study of ancient cultures through the study of their extant writings. The word Urtext dates from the time when early philologists were coming to realize that the two major bodies of texts from the two ancient traditions from which Western culture is descended, the Iliad and the Odyssey from the Greek, the books that make up the Old Testament from the Jewish, were in fact oral traditions that at some point had been written down. Those first transcriptions had been lost, and the surviving text that was clear all post-dated the first transcriptions by centuries, perhaps in some cases by a millennium or more. But, these philologists reasoned, there must have been a first time that each such epic or each such book of the Bible had been written down, and that first text was an Urtext, the text from which, through who knows how many intermediaries, and with who knows how many changes, all of the extant texts had been derived. As time went by, it became respectable for philologists to work in post-classical periods, in particular with medieval epics that are the monuments of national scriptures. So these epics were Das Nibelungenlied for German-speaking peoples, Le Chanson de Roland for French-speaking peoples, Beowulf for English-speaking peoples. All of these entities, because we can't call them works, originated as oral traditions, and like the Iliad and the Odyssey and the books of the Old Testament, had at some point been written down. In these cases, too, the first transcriptions had been lost, and the earliest extant text post-dated the lost first transcriptions by centuries. Urtext could be applied in such situations without changing its meaning, the text of the first transcription. As more time went by, philologists began to deal with authors from the 16th and later centuries, authors whose holographs might still be extant or, if lost, were not far removed from the earliest extant texts. Such authorial manuscripts represented the author's intentions, pure and undefiled, uncorrupted by the mistakes and tinkerings of later copyists and compositors and house editors. The term Urtext was now applied to such manuscripts. Now, this is a fundamental reconception. An author's fair copy of a work that has been conceived and developed in text is quite different from the first text to which an oral entity has been committed. But the future stuck, and Urtext came also to mean the author's manuscript. Now, how was Urtext picked up by musicians and musicologists? The 19th century saw a substantial increase in the degree of control the composers of Western music were trying to exert over performance of their compositions. As the 19th century wore on, musical texts were characterized by an increasing density of markings, indicating tempi, dynamics, articulation, and other nuances. So that when, late in the 19th century, a composer brought his newest composition to a publisher, his manuscript was likely to be filled with such markings. But the 19th century was also a retrospective century. And they were not just editions of new music, but editions of the music that was the glory of each people's cultural heritage. And the earlier the music, the fewer were likely to be the markings that were present in the earlier texts. And there was a belief that potential purchasers of the day needed such markings. In fact, 19th century publishers were very much concerned with providing the sorts of performance guidance that would encourage amateurs to buy their editions of older music. In the 1830s, when the Leipzig music publisher C.F. Peters undertook to publish the first collected edition of Bach's keyboard works, Peters retained to supervise the project and to prepare some of the editions himself, Karl Czerny, who was one of the great piano virtuosi and pedagogues of his day. In his own editions, Czerny was concerned less with what Bach actually wrote than how he, Czerny, played the music himself. And today, his edition of Bach's 48 Preludes and Fugues is notorious for its text of BWV 866, the Prelude and Fugue in B major, Book 1, to which Czerny has added a final measure with a resounding chord at the end, so that the piece ends not with a quiet eighth note as Bach intended, but with a dramatic bang. Czerny was not the only celebrity editor. In fact, so many editions were edited by famous performers that this sort of edition came to be known as an interpretive edition. When the performer was a real superstar, it was known as a virtuoso edition. And virtuoso did not refer to the fact that the editor was a virtuoso editor and could really do a terrific job editing. It referred to the fact that he was a famous performer. Implicit in the name of a famous performer on the cover of such a publication was a promise that if you bought the edition, you too would be able to play the pieces it contained the way he or she did. Czerny, Hans von Bülow, Franz Liszt were the most famous, today the most infamous of these virtuoso editors. But even editions of earlier music prepared by relatively low profile or even anonymous editors provided performance guidance. And that guidance represented how the editors played the pieces in their own day, not in the composer's day. That guidance was not, as we would say today, historically informed. By the end of the 19th century, a reaction had set in against the addition of so many editorial suggestions to music of earlier periods. German philology had developed the historical approach called Altkunstwissenschaft, the science of study of times long past. Central to this approach as it developed in the 19th century was the sense of historical distance, the idea that the past should be dealt with in its own terms, not anachronistically in ours. There was a realization that religions and forms of government and social relationships and customs of all sorts change over time, and that to assume that a writer hundreds of years ago thought the same way about any particular subject as we do today is an unpardonable presumption, and we now give it the name of presentism. Today, the aphorism popular among historians to explain this idea comes from the opening of The Go-Between, which is a short story by G.P. Hartley. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Now, the impact of such ideas on music was an objection to editions in which editors had added any interpretive or technical suggestions of their own. The people who made these objections argued that the text of an edition should be the text, just as the composer left it, pure and undefiled without any editorially provided technical or interpretive guidance. To prepare such an edition, an editor went to the earlier surviving sources, the composer's holograph if it was available, an authorized edition if there was no holograph, or if there was neither holograph nor authorized edition, to the source likely to be closest to the lost holograph. This source served as a basis for the edition. The editor did no more than transcribe that source into early 20th century notation, clean up mechanical mistakes, and resolve ambiguities. To identify such an edition, innocent of editorial performance guidance, people borrowed a term from philology. They spoke of such an edition as Urtext. Used thus, Urtext had both positive and negative meanings. In the positive sense, Urtext edition presented the composer's text as he had left it. The negative meaning responded to the common practice of adding technical and interpretive guidance by asserting that in an Urtext edition, there was no such guidance. So Urtext had, for many years, a very specific meaning when used in a musical context. And this was, if you will, its meaning. Understand that Urtext didn't sweep away the established practices. People interested in Urtext were usually concerned with music of rather earlier date than the music that constituted the repertoire in which most purchasers of printed music were interested. All sorts of interpretive editions continue to be published, and they are still being published today. This is because the vast majority of purchasers of printed music think that they need such guidance, and they are happy to get it from somebody who they consider an authority. Interpretive edition today is a dirty word. So such editions are variously referred to as performing editions or practical editions, another example of the precision of publishing terminology. And all of the above explains why, in current usage, in musical circles, the verb to edit has two meanings that are diametrically opposed. On the one hand, to edit means to establish a text representing some specific state of the musical work at some specific moment in the past, usually but not always the moment at which the composer put down his quill or his pen and declared his work finished. Thus we speak of capturing the composer's latest intentions. On the other hand, to edit means to provide guidance, technical and or interpretive. Thus we speak of an edition that is, we say, heavily edited, meaning that lots of such markings have been added by the editor. In terms of the numbers of copies sold, editions edited in the second sense far outsell editions that simply try to recover some earlier state of the text. There are many volunteer choir directors who want to be told what passages should be sung loudly and what passages softly, when the tempo should be faster and when slower. And they buy choral octavos edited by famous choral directors to get just such direction, and they would feel very much shortchanged if they bought an edition without such markings. Now, one might think that the way to prepare an interpretive edition should be first to prepare an Urtext edition, and then to add interpretive and technical markings. And sometimes this is done. But, in fact, it's not always done. Editors of interpretive editions usually aren't historical musicologists comfortable working with original sources. The identities of such editors usually lie somewhere else, as performers, as educators, conductors, choral directors. Some, for shame, can't even read the notations of some of the earlier pieces they put their name to as having edited. But that doesn't matter. After all, the value added in such an edition prepared by a famous performer lies in the famous performer's notes and markings. And sometimes the notes the famous performer is in the habit of performing are not the notes that the composer wrote. Recall that Czerny added a measure to BWV 866. So going back to the original sources is not always relevant. Often what such editors do is go to an existing edition, say a collected edition or a national set such as DTO or DDT, and they simply take a text found there and add to it the technical and interpretive markings that are their contribution. After the Second World War, an important development in the history of the word Urtext took place. The war had virtually wiped out the old German music houses. Peters had been confiscated before the war because it was a Jewish firm. The Weikup factory in Leipzig had been bombed out. But Gunther Hemmler was an industrialist with a serious interest in music and had enough money to start a serious publishing firm that he hoped would turn out first-rate editions. In 1948, soon after Hemmler Verlag was founded, there began to appear a series of editions with texts based upon the earlier sources available, but containing enough editorially supplied technical and interpretive markings to avoid alienating purchasers in that mass market who felt that they needed such guidance. Such editions were not as heavily marked as had been some of the pre-war editions, but they were not devoid of such markings, and so they could not properly have been called Urtext in the then accepted sense of the term. Nevertheless, that's what they were called, the Henley Urtext editions. And all of you have seen them in their steel gray covers. Now you may wonder, how did this curious misuse of the term come about? The Henley website gives us this narrative, and I quote verbatim its English version. Whilst looking for a fitting term to differentiate his editions from all others, Gunther Henle lit upon the word Urtext in isolated text-critical editions. In short, Henle found the word in some obscure scholarly editions, it sounded sexy, and he appropriated it. Other Henle publicity materials tried to give a more elaborate, or less embarrassing, history of the term. And Henle's website disingenuously begins its page on Urtext with this sentence: "The term Urtext has been debated ever since it was first used." Nonsense. Everybody knew what Urtext meant until Henle came along and muddled the issue by misusing it. And the advertising copy on Henle's website that offers a lengthy and self-serving discussion of Urtext with much talk about stripping away layers of distortion, which incidentally an editor who's working with the original sources doesn't have to do, does a disservice to potential users who are trying to figure out just what an Urtext edition, even in Henle's sense of the term, means. Now, Gunther Henle may have been clueless about the meaning of Urtext, but he was right in identifying Urtext as a catchy word with marketing appeal. And soon there were other series called Urtext following Henle's formula. These are editions based on authoritative sources when available, a feature that distinguishes them from the sort of interpretive editions that simply add markings to somebody else's text. And they provide just enough editorial guidance to hold the buyers who want such guidance. They are a carefully calibrated compromise in order to retain as many markets as possible. Following Henle's Urtext were Universal Editions Wiener Urtext series. And then the series of Baronreiter began to apply Urtext to. First, its spin-offs and its major collected editions, like the NBA and the NMA, and later to its independent editions, such as Broude's Pachelbel. So we now have current two mutually exclusive meanings of Urtext. On the one hand, there is the original musical meaning, an edition that recovers the composer's text from the earliest sources, but which does not add editorial markings. On the other, there's the more recent meaning, an edition that recovers the composer's text from the earliest sources, but that provides such advice. And so we have what would once have been the absurdity of an Urtext edition with fingerings by so-and-so. This is not a good situation. Sometimes it leads to comic complications, and I will tell you a story, but I will not use names. In the 1960s, well, I'll use one name, but it's not germane to whom you should know about. In the 1960s, a prominent German firm spun off from one of its collected editions the score and parts to one of the most popular sets of pieces in the orchestra repertoire. Your former colleague and mine, Joe Boonin, the only name I'll use, who was at the time running a small publishing house, obtained the exclusive rights for distribution of this edition in America and advertised this new edition in journals, including our own notes, as Urtext. In those days, copyright had to be renewed after a first term of 28 years, and unfortunately, when the renewal time came, the German publisher's American agent neglected to file the papers, with the result that the edition passed into the public domain in America. The firm of Calmus, which, as you all know, combs the copyright register for such oversights, noted the omission and promptly pounced on it and reprinted the edition. Understandably, you'll understand the German publisher was upset. So it began looking for a way to resecure copyright. Looking at the text that they had published, the German publisher realized that in fact they contained all sorts of editorially added technical and interpretive markings. And so they removed these markings, thereby creating the text that was Urtext in the original sense of the word. And then they registered the new text for copyright. And that way they resecured their copyright in an Urtext edition. So the two meanings of Urtext were products of their historical context. Both depended upon the postmodern sense of différence, defining what they were by what they were not. These two meanings and the confusion they engender will shortly become irrelevant as the historical context changes once again. And that context is changing because technology has caught up with Urtext. Once again, it is Handel that is making the decisive contribution, and this time a positive one. It adds an announcement using the clause, "NEMLA is going digital." NEMLA Verlag has announced the imminent appearance of digital forms of its NEMLA Urtext series. These editions are conceived for use on iPads and computer monitors, and they will not be sold through traditional music shops, but rather in electronic stores that handle computers. Handler advertises that these digital editions will be able to present a base layer representing a text established by the editor, but without the addition of any interpretive or technical markings, and that they will also have interpretive and technical markings added by not one, but by several different well-known performers or educators. From what I can infer, Handler's publications will make use of a Photoshop-like technology based on layers. There will be a base image for the text that the editor has established as representing, say, the composer's latest attentions, without anything added. Then there will be a set of layers, each layer containing the performing suggestions of a different performer or editor that can be superimposed over that base image. There will even be a layer that will be able to store the user's own markings. Such technology has been around since the 1990s and has been tried out with mixed successes in various contexts. Orchestras, for example, have not accepted it. But NEMLA is the first to bring it to a mass market in these terms. I think it likely, I certainly hope, that NEMLA will be successful with this approach and that other publishers will follow. And thus we will have publications that blend into a single edition the different sorts of editions that in print required several separate publications. In print context, provide an unadorned base text and performance markings by 3 editors would require 4 separate publications. Or if one wanted to be fancy, 1 publication presented the unadorned text and 3 sets of transparent overlays printed, say, on acetate, which you would lay over that base text, containing the markings of one editor and the markings of another performer editor. With headless digital arrangement, it won't be necessary to distinguish among various sorts of editions, between Urtext in the original sense and interpretive editions of various sorts, and incidentally aimed at various levels of performers. In a single publication, one layer will be an Urtext layer, Urtext in the original sense, and the other layers will be interpretive. One publication will include everything, and one publication will address all possible markets. And so Urtext, with all its mutually inconsistent meanings, will pass peacefully into the past. I should add that what Headless seems to be proposing is a graphic program, not a musical program. Meanwhile, one is faced with the practical question of how to tell what is meant by Urtext when the word Urtext appears on the title page of an edition you happen to have in your hand. One can begin by looking at the music. If there are performance indications such as fingerings and bowings or dynamics and tempi in music that did not originally have such indications, then chances are good that this is not Urtext in the original sense. But just as important as the music is a statement of editorial policies and critical apparatus. The statement of editorial policies should tell you what sorts of things, if any, the editor has added, and how are they distinguished typographically. Dynamics in the source or in Roman, editorially added dynamics or in italic. If there is neither a statement of editorial policies nor critical apparatus, then Urtext is really not an issue for you. The publisher probably has no idea of what Urtext might mean, but is simply using the word because he thinks it's going to sell copies. One could also make some inferences by looking at the date of publication. If the publication is a German or Austrian publication, or reprint thereof dating from, say, 1945 or earlier, then it's likely that the edition is using Urtext in the original sense. If the edition dates from after the Second World War, very often then you're on your own. You've got to work it out. It is an axiom of linguistics that language is developed not only by inventing new words and importing words from other languages, but by applying existing words metaphorically to concepts that the words did not previously denote, but that nevertheless have enough in common with the original meanings to make the metaphor seem valid. But this concept assumes an ideal world and an orderly process. In the real world, where advertising hype gives new words, new meanings with a dazzling rapidity, expanding the meaning of a word sometimes removes all meaning whatsoever. And this is what happened with Urtext. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronald. We have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Okay, so another layer of confusion into this. So if you're trying to study performance reception history, maybe in the 19th century in Bach works, then consideration of these 19th century editions and how those pieces were performed then might rise to the top. I don't know if that's really a question or a statement, but what do you think of that?
Yes, it's important. No matter what we think, we today pick up a piece from the 18th century, and we think we can jump back over all the intervening centuries to pick up what Bach really thought. No, we are influenced by what came in between. We are the inheritors, particularly with recordings going back 100 years now, of all of that tradition. So if we're interested in performing practice, yes, we go back and we look at the 19th century editions. There was published a couple of years ago an edition of Chopin's personal copy of the 48 Preludes and Fugues, which is of no interest if you're interested only in Bach and how it was performed back in 17 whatever. but which is of interest if you want to know how Chopin was teaching his students in the mid-19th century. So, yeah. I would add also that it sometimes happens that even in a good musicological edition, performance indications are sometimes put into the edition. That is, contemporary performance indications. So you may have absolutely unadorned holograph, but you've also got another source that has continual figures or ornamentation. You may put those continual figures in over the holograph, but bracketed in some way or identified in some way, so you give not only what the composer thought, but also what other people at the time were doing. And it works as long as you are able to distinguish either typographically or to tell the user all the performance indications have been taken from source such and such. And a good performing edition today will give you effectively bare-based, bare text, and they will tell you we have added to these 18th century these pieces by Jeremiah Ingalls, which were really sung all out, no subtlety at all. We have added dynamics and tempi, and you can sing them now as if they were a 20th century piece. But they say, the editorial introduction will say, all the tempi and dynamics are the editors. Just ignore them if you're looking at the original text.
Any other questions?